Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. In this video, as we approach the release of the second edition of my Poetic Edda translation, I want to talk a little bit about how the Norns, the women who determine fate for gods and human beings alike, appear in the pages of the Poetic Edda. So as I've been preparing the second edition translation, I've been extremely attentive to how I translate what I see before me in Old Norse and making sure that what you see on the translated page can be traced back to the original. That, I'm making it more approachable for the English-speaking reader of today, but not getting rid of things that are there, not smoothing over differences between things that are there, or introducing differences that are not different in the original text. And also not letting our popular modern ideas about Norse gods and other beings influence the way that I translate something that sometimes is not as plain, not as understandable as what we would want in a modern text, right? These texts are composed as poetry for people who already know these stories, and so sometimes they allude to things that we simply don't know about. Well, one thing that really intrigued me was also in preparing the glossary for that book, I was making sure that each glossary entry for different beings and their names would reference where you could read about them, right? I want you to be able to look up Norns and see, well, where can I read about the Norns? Which poems are they in? And what really surprised me or interested me was that the Norns show up in Voluspa, to use modern Icelandic pronunciation, the first poem in the Poetic Edda, which is the beginning of the world and then an account of Ragnarok. And then they skip all the other poems about the gods, and they only show up then in the last half of the Poetic Edda in all of the poems about heroes, which are much less read by interested people today. So, first of all, to look at how they appear in Voluspa, I'll just use modern Icelandic pronunciation here because it doesn't matter as much. People are less likely to think that I'm doing something wrong. We have one stanza that unambiguously mentions them. Other stanzas potentially do, although we aren't certain. I'm not going to go into whether the three young women from the Jotuns who show up early in the gods' history might be the Norns. They might be, but it's just, it's unknowable. But stanza 20 definitely mentions them. It says, Þaðan koma meyjar, margs vitandi, þrjár þeim sæ, þolli stendur, urð hétu eina, aðra verðandi, skáru á skíði, skuld ina þriðju, þær lugðu, þær líf kuru, alda börnum, örlög segja. So from there come young women, meyjar, knowing much, vitandi margs, three of them out of that water, þeim sæ. So it seems like they're actually emerging perhaps from the well, Urðarbrunnar, the well of Urður, which stands under the tree. They call one Urð, another's the second one Verðandi. They cut on a plank, a piece of wood. They call the third Skuld. They laid down laws. They chose lives for the children of men, for human beings. The fate of men, örlög segja. That's segja with two G's, not like the modern Icelandic verb segja, say. So we have them here, interestingly talked about in the past tense at the end of that. They chose, they laid down. They may not be actively doing it right now. I think the notion of them coming out of the water is interesting. Do they inhabit the well itself? Are they like Mimir, whose head seems to inhabit the water of his well, which may or may not be the same as their well? Their names, of course, famously, Urður is related to the Old English weird, which means fates in Old English in a poem like Beowulf. Verdandi means becoming, happening, and skuld means should, ought. Also a name shared by a Valkyrie, which the line between Valkyrie and Norn may be pretty permeable in some of these old sources. The middle four lines there about their names, Urð hétu eina, aðra verdandi, skaru á skíði, skuld ena þriðju, are in a different meter. They are in Málaháttur, which is a more regular syllable counting meter, a little bit later in origin than the forniðuslag meter that's used in most of Voluspa and the rest of the Poetic Edda. That little set of four lines may actually be an insertion into what was originally an 8-line stanza. From there come young women knowing much, 3 out of that water which stands under the tree. They laid down laws, they chose lives for men, the fates of men, which is interesting because actually the forniðuslag parts of Voluspa seem to be quite old. Both Christopher Sapp's study in 2022 and my independent study using some of the same data and methods suggest that Voluspa was composed in the 900s AD. Of course, written down in the 1200s in the Koningsbók manuscript and the 1300s in the Högsbók manuscript. Let me mention, well, we're talking here about my good friends Grimfrost in Sweden. They make really high quality replica Viking gear, and that includes things like board games. They also sell books. I believe soon they'll be selling my Wanderer's Journal, which is where I've written down my notes for this video. These are blank journals that also let you write whatever you want, and they contain pages that have quotes from Havamal, Odin's wisdom, done in Old Norse and the Younger Futhak runes by me, the runes that are accurate to the Viking Age, and then with my cowboy Havamal translation. I also hope you'll consider supporting this channel on Patreon. The highest tier, you get to get monthly live updates on my work on the Prose Edda translation. And I hope you'll look for the second edition of my Poetic Edda translation cover reveal a little bit later this month, and it will be available in September 2025. Now that I just talked about the names of the individual Norns, what about that word Norn? It is of uncertain derivation, but I think that the safest possible cognate is probably the one nearest at hand, right? I'm going to look for cognates in Scandinavian languages before I look for them in English and German. And there aren't persuasive English and German cognates, but there is a Swedish dialect word. It's usually nyrna, but it can be nyrna, it can be norna, which means to warn secretly. So for example, in the SAOB, the Swedish Academy Dictionary, we see this citation, Drängen nyrnade åt sjömannen att icke räcka fram händen. The boy secretly warned the seaman not to stretch forth his hand. So the secret warning is kind of cool. You know, maybe they're the ones who secretly warn, who whisper or something like that. Also, since, as I said, the distinction between Norns and Valkyries and even witches is pretty permeable, right? And modern Icelandic Notn is, it can just be witch, right? And I think that often these old sources don't have as rigid classifications of these beings as we want to give them today. So, as I mentioned, the Norns come up much more often in heroic poems. For example, the last poem that's in the Codex Regius or Koningsbók manuscript of the Poetic Edda is Hamdismal, which ends, Ekki hygg ég okkur vera úlfadæmi, að við minnum sjálfur sakast, sem grey notna, þau gráðug eru í auðn alin. Vel höfum við vegið, stundum á valgotna ofan eggmóðum sem etnir á kvisti. Góðs höfum týrar fengið, þótt skilum nú eða í gær deyja. Kveld lifir maður ekki, eftir kvið notna. I don't think that we are of the kind of wolves, that we're wolf-like, that we would fight one another ourselves, like the greyhounds are just the dogs of the Norns, the wolves of the Norns, the canines that dispose of lives. Those who are greedy, nurtured in the wilderness. So Groi Norna, the greyhounds, the dogs, the wolves of the Norns, are the ones who destroy lives, right? So Norns are viewed negatively here. We have fought well. We stand on corpses of Goths. We over the edge wounded corpses of Goths like eagles on a branch. We have earned good honor, though we should die yesterday or today. A man does not live one evening after the decree of the Norns. And that decree of the Norns, Kviður Norna, comes up again and again and again. We also have some other interesting occurrences besides just talking about the decree of the Norns, which is usually how they come up, just someone talking about how the Norns have decided my fate to be such and such. Of course, in Fáfnismál, the dragon Fáfnir, after he's been killed by the hero Sigurður, tells him, Sundur bodnar mjög, hygg ég at nodnir sé, eigu þær eitt saman, sumar eru áskungar, sumar álfkungar, sumar dætur dvalens. I think that the Norns are very differently born. They do not have family together. Some are from the family of the gods, the Aesir gods. Some are from the family of elves. Some are daughters of Dvalin, i.e. dwarves. That reflects a very different opinion of the Norns, that they're not these three women who stand by the well by Yggdrasil and make fate. They are then maybe there's lesser Norns. Fáfnismál also appears to be quite an old poem from the 900s, so this conception is probably equally old as the conception that's in Voluspa. We also have in Atlakvida the very interesting remark by Gudrun in stanza 16, where she says, among a lot of other things, Better hefðir þú bróðir að þú léttir notnir gráta. Brother, it would have been better if you had let the Norns weep. Now, Jón Helgason, I think, was the first to point out in his commentary about this in the 60s, and others have pointed out, well, the Norns probably don't weep. So maybe that's just to say, leave the weeping to those who won't even do, just be pitiless. Although another possible etymology for Norn would connect it to Old English Gnornion, to mourn. In fact, Norn is a very archaic modern English word for mourn, but then it's hard to see where that G would have gone, because we wouldn't expect that G to be lost in Old Norse. Finally, I'll leave you with the fact that, as I said, these words for supernatural women get sort of blended together and can even be used as an insult. So in Gudrun Kviða 1, which is, according to SAP's and my testing, one of the oldest poems in the Poetic Edda, although there's parts of Voluspa that are as old, Guthrun, who I think is Gudrun's aunt, says to Brynhildr, Þegi þú þjóðleið þeirra orða, orður öðlinga, hefur þú æ verið, rekkur þig alda hver illrar skepnu. Be silent, one hated by the nation, by the people of these words. You have always been an Urður, right, a Norn, for princes, for high-ranking people. Everyone of bad fate drives you, or maybe drives you away. I don't know if that's that every being that determines a bad fate drives you away, or that people who have been fated badly drive you away. The text that's a very ambiguous line in the Poetic Edda, one that I struggle with quite a bit, but I would take it, if you ask me right now, as beings of bad fate drive you on. So there's kind of a sense that those who determine that your fate is bad, they're not just messengers, they're actively malicious to you, right? And we see a lot of kind of mixed notions about these, bad women, Norns, Valkyries sometimes just witches that sit by the side of the road that we're warned about in like Reynsmal and part of Havamal and Lotvatnismal. There's this notion that there are evil, supernatural, or magically empowered female beings who do bad things to us. And it's not just that they're carrying out some impartial fate, but it is somehow partial, right? There's malevolence that lies behind it. So maybe the Norns themselves are malevolent, and that might suggest that those three mysterious women who show up from Jotunheimar at the beginning of the gods' history in Voluspa are the Norns, but the text doesn't say that. And one of the things that I've been very willing to do in the second edition of the Poetic Edda translation that I was less willing to do in the first is to leave questions as questions and not try to answer them if the text itself doesn't say that. I want you to get the same impartial look at the text that I get when I look at it in Old Norse, and not my personal, shall we say, interpretation or lens on it as much as I can prevent that. Well, as I said, I hope you're looking forward to the second edition of the Poetic Edda. I know I'm looking forward to having that out there for you. And for now, thank you, Patreon. Thanks to those buying my books, taking the Zoom classes. And from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.
How did you know that a bear wasn't going to eat me or something?
Bears don't want to eat me?
But like, they might want to eat me.
I don't think so.
He just left.
What?